I came to my son's house on New Year's Eve without warning. My grandson was standing by the gate barefoot, wearing nothing but a t-shirt. It was 14 degrees outside. Through the window, I could see a table glowing with holiday lights. The whole family was sitting there, eating. I broke the door down with my shoulder. And before we continue, tell me in the comments whether there was ever a moment in your life when you realized that staying silent any longer would mean betraying someone. We're starting a new story. I hope you enjoy listening. 3 years earlier, David Miller's wife packed a suitcase and left Des Moines without saying where she was going. Without even leaving a note on the nightstand for 13-year-old Luke. David worked as a maintenance mechanic at a manufacturing plant. He took every overtime shift he could get, came home after dark, and the boy sat alone after school, waiting for his father. Margaret Miller, David's mother, was still alive then. Every Sunday, she called her grandson over, fed him, mended his jacket, and checked his notebooks. But the weekdays belonged to David, and David wasn't handling them. David met Julie Anderson through mutual friends. She was divorced and had a 10-year-old daughter named Ava. Julie owned a sturdy brick house in Ankeny. A fence, a gate, a garage, a neat yard. Everything was well kept, solid, and proper. Mom, objectively speaking, Julie's a good woman, David said over the phone back then. She's a great homemaker. She cooks beautifully. She keeps her house in perfect order. Luke needs a firm woman's hand at his age. You know that. I can't carry all of this alone anymore, not physically. I come home from work and collapse. Luke needs a father first, David, Margaret answered. A father who is present and actually involved with his son, not military discipline and the firm hand of some strange woman who doesn't care about him at all. Did you even ask the boy what he thinks about all this, just for decency's sake? Mom, don't start. He's only 13. The only things on his mind right now are sitting at the computer longer and kicking a ball around outside. I'm the only adult in this family. I earn the money, so I make the decisions that are good for everyone. That's exactly the point, David. He's already 13. At that age, they see everything and understand perfectly well. They just don't know how to say it to an adult's face yet. But David had already made up his mind. The wedding was modest. Julie took his last name, and David and Luke moved into her house in Ankeny. Frank Miller, David's father, said nothing, though something scraped at him deep down. His son and grandson were moving into someone else's house, onto someone else's territory. But David looked happy. Luke even smiled at first, and at the family dinner, Julie spoke gently to the boy and put extra food on his plate. The changes didn't come all at once. Julie made comments about a plate that had not been washed properly, crumbs on the table, sneakers left in the hallway. Then the comments became rules. The rules became punishments. Meals were on a schedule. The phone was a privilege that could be taken away for any mistake. Ava got a full plate. Luke got whatever was left. At the table, he had no right to speak until someone spoke to him first. Grandpa, hi. Listen, she wouldn't let me eat lunch today. Luke called his grandfather once, catching a moment when the phone happened to be in his hands. She said I had to earn the right to sit at the family table first, and nobody was obligated to feed me just because. I haven't eaten anything all day. Grandpa, my stomach already hurts. What kind of nonsense is that? What do you mean? She wouldn't let you eat. What terrible crime are they starving you for? I just didn't put my tea mug in the sink right away. I left one mug on the table, Grandpa, just one, and she started yelling. She said, since you clearly don't value cleanliness or other people's work, you clearly don't need dinner either. Frank, called David. His son sighed into the phone, already irritated. Dad, come on, not again. You know how teenagers are these days. He exaggerates and turns nothing into drama, and you believe him. Julie is just trying to teach him basic order. What's criminal about that? The kid talked back after being corrected. She reacted appropriately to disrespect. That's all. Leaving a growing boy without dinner because of one dirty mug. David, do you even hear yourself? Doesn't anything click in that head of yours? What I hear is that you and Mom spoiled him rotten, turned life into a resort, and now I'm the one who has to deal with him and reap the rewards of your parenting. Yes, Julie is strict. She has her rules, but she is absolutely fair. Everything is fine here, Dad. Live in peace, and please stop interfering in our family. After hearing her husband tell the story, Margaret shook her head and said quietly, "Frank, listen to me. Something very wrong is happening to that boy over there. I feel it in my heart. A mother's instinct doesn't lie." Frank calmed her down. David would never allow anything bad to happen. He was Luke's father. She gave him a long look and said nothing. He remembered that look often afterward. That winter, Frank and Luke went ice fishing on Sailorville Lake. On the ice, his grandson came alive. He started talking, laughing, telling stories about school. He became a different person. And because of that contrast, something ached in Frank's chest. After they caught a few fish, they stopped at a small bathhouse near the lake to warm up. In the changing room, Frank noticed a fresh bruise on his grandson's shoulder. It was too clear, with a sharp outline. "Luke, look at me. What kind of artwork is that on your shoulder? Where did a bruise that big come from?" "I hit the door frame. Turned too fast in the dark, misjudged it, and clipped my shoulder. It's nothing." Luke pulled on his shirt without lifting his eyes. "Grandpa, listen, could I maybe stay with you a little longer this time? Just a couple more days at least. I like it here. It's quiet at your place. And we were going to go fishing again. We could just hang out." "Good Lord, of course. Stay as long as you want. Why are you even asking? This is your home, too. The door is always open." "Really? I really can?" There was so much in that "really" that Frank's throat tightened. But an hour later, David called and demanded that he bring his son back. Julie was unhappy. When Luke heard that, he silently pulled on his jacket and went out to the car. He didn't argue. He didn't beg. He already knew begging was useless. 8 months ago, Margaret died. The house on the edge of Des Moines became orphaned, but it still held her everywhere. Crocheted doilies on the shelves, jars of jam in the pantry, labeled in her rounded handwriting, "Cherry July," "Current June." Frank never changed the kitchen radio from the station she had liked. On the wall beside the refrigerator hung a black and white photograph of young Margaret with a guitar at a factory party, one corner bent. Without her, Frank was left alone with his temper, and for the first time in 40 years of marriage. He wasn't sure that was a bad thing. On December 31st, he laid 2 gifts for Luke on the passenger seat of his old Chevy Blazer, an ice fishing rod with a reel, and the 3rd book in the fantasy series his grandson had been reading for 2 years. He called David. The call was rejected after the 3rd ring. He tried again. Same thing. Heavy snow was falling outside. The radio announced a winter storm warning, but Frank was already pulling onto the highway. Halfway there, he stopped at a gas station. It was warm inside and smelled like fresh coffee. The cashier, a young woman with a braid over one shoulder, looked over his purchases on the counter. The fishing rod wrapped in newspaper, the book in gift paper, 3 chocolate bars, and a thermos. "Wow, sir, where are you heading in weather like this? Visibility out there is almost 0. The road is getting buried. I'm making it to Ankeny. My family's waiting for me. It's New Year's Eve. Can't be late." "Oh, come on." They just said on the radio that 2 cars are already in the ditch. Traffic's almost stopped. Maybe wait out the blizzard here. Look, we've got hot coffee. Pastries just came out of the oven. The TV's on, it's warm and cozy. How is this not a 5-star resort? Ah, sweetheart, in my day I rode a regular bicycle through blizzards like this to get to a factory shift, back when this fancy highway of yours was still just a dirt road. And as you can see, I always made it alive. The bicycle, granted, took early retirement after that experience and fell apart. But I made it every time. The girl laughed and looked at the fishing rod, then at the white wall of snow beyond the window, then back at the rod. Come on, you're not seriously going fishing, are you? December 31st, right before midnight, in this polar blizzard, I'm heading out on the most important fishing trip of my life. Frank nodded solemnly. I need to catch my grandson. That's a big fish. Well, if it's that serious a fishing trip, then I officially bless it. She rang up the purchases and winked. Happy New Year. Make sure you catch your grandson. He raised one hand without turning around, pushed the door open with his shoulder, and walked out into the storm. The blazer bit into the snow. The wipers could barely keep up. The headlights pulled slanted white streaks and rare road signs out of the darkness. Half an hour stretched into an hour. Frank turned the wheel and thought about how happy Luke would be about the fishing rod, how they would sit down at the table together, how that evening would glue back something that had been coming apart at the seams for 3 years. In his mind, he heard his wife's voice. Family isn't walls, it's the people inside them. Julie's house appeared through the blizzard like a festive painting. Garland on the fence, warm light in the windows, a Christmas tree sparkling behind the glass, smoke curling from the chimney. Through the window, a set table and silhouettes of people, a perfect holiday picture. And by the gate stood Luke, barefoot on the packed snow, wearing a t-shirt, hugging himself and shifting from foot to foot. Frank killed the engine and jumped out into the cold. His grandson's face was gray, his lips bluish. His feet were turning raw red against the white snow, and a waxy paleness had touched his toes. Frank tore off his sheepskin coat, threw it over Luke's shoulders, yanked off his own felt-lined boots, and pulled them onto the boy's feet. The gate wasn't locked, but the front door was locked from the inside. Through the double-pane windows came music, voices, and the clinking of glasses. They were celebrating New Year's Eve. "Grandpa, please get out of here," Luke whispered. "If Julie sees you through the window, it'll only get worse for me later. She's already losing her mind. I'm going to pay for that stupid duck now. It cannot get worse than this. Trust me. Get to the car. Now." In the blazer, Frank turned the heat all the way up, pulled a blanket from the back, wrapped his grandson in it, and began rubbing his feet. They were stiff, frozen, and barely bending. "All right. Now sit up straight, warm up, and tell me everything exactly as it happened. No hiding anything. Start from the beginning." Julie had told him to watch the duck in the oven while she went into town for groceries. He got distracted by his phone. The skin on top became a little darker than she wanted. It didn't burn. It wasn't ruined. It just got darker. When Julie came back and opened the oven, she screamed so loudly that Ava ran to her room. Useless. Did it on purpose. Humiliated me in front of guests. Then she took his phone, took the house keys, opened the door, and told him to go out past the gate and stand there until he understood what he had done. "Where was your father while this was happening?" Frank asked. His own voice sounded foreign to him. Dad came into the kitchen at first when she started yelling. But Julie cut him off right away and told him not to interfere with her parenting. He stood there for a little while, looked at me without saying anything, then turned around and went back to the living room. He even closed the door tighter behind him, so he wouldn't have to hear the yelling. It happened around 4 o'clock. It was now almost 5 in the evening. Luke had stood by the gate for nearly an hour in 14-degree weather, no shoes, no coat, no phone. For several minutes, Luke said nothing, warming his hands in the hot air from the heater. Frank didn't rush him. He waited, rubbing the boy's feet, until Luke began to speak on his own. At first reluctantly, then faster and faster, choking on words that had been piling up for 3 years. Last month, Julie had made him sleep in the garage because he forgot to take out the trash. The garage wasn't heated, and he sat there until morning on an old car seat, covered with an oil-stained cover. For breaking a glass, she refused to let him eat for a day and a half, until you learn to value other people's property. And last winter, on the previous New Year's Eve, when Frank came over and spent the night in the house, Julie told Luke to stay quiet at the table. Frank had thought it was teenage moodiness. After dinner, she threw him out over some tiny mistake, and the boy spent the night on the back seat of Frank's Blazer, which was parked behind the fence. "Hold on, Luke." Frank stopped rubbing his feet and raised his head. So that evening I was sitting in the warmth, drinking tea with candy like some lord at a resort, pleased as could be about what a civilized little family we had turned into, while you were outside chattering your teeth. "I was in the car, Grandpa. It didn't lock, and it was warmer there than in the garage. I came back in the morning before you woke up." Frank turned toward the windshield, where the blizzard danced outside, and for several seconds he couldn't breathe. Something hot and heavy filled his chest. He wanted to get out into the cold and pound his fists against the fence until the feeling let go. "Luke, don't you try to soften this for me. What that madam is doing is not parenting, and it's not strict discipline. It's a concentration camp, dressed up as a nice home. Pure abuse and pretty wrapping. Do you understand? We're not raising a Spartan here. They're breaking a boy. Grandpa, please don't." Luke shrank into the blanket. "If you go in there and make a scene, she'll take it all out on me later. It'll only get worse. It always gets worse when someone interferes. And where was your parent of the year during all this? Where was your own father looking when you were thrown out of the house like a defective part from a warehouse? Does he even know how to raise his voice? Dad says Julie just wants order. He says I need to try harder. He says it's her house and her rules. Fine. And your mother? Did you tell her about all this artwork? Did you call her even once?" Luke went silent and pulled the edge of the blanket up to his chin. "Mom left when I was 13. She doesn't call. That's it. Conversation over. We're shutting this circus down. You're coming with me to Des Moines today. Right now. We're not waiting for their holiday cheer to get completely out of hand. She won't let me go. Dad won't allow it. Julie will call the police and say you kidnapped me. Let her try. Give her a flag to wave and a drum to beat. I'm not afraid of the police. I worked 40 years in a factory and saw entire battalions of generals in skirts, just like her. Let her call the SWAT team for all I care. I'll bury any local officer in arguments when it comes to my grandson." Frank turned off the heater, got out of the car, and walked to the front door. He didn't knock. He didn't ring the bell. He took 3 steps back, rushed forward, and slammed his shoulder beside the lock. He was 68, but 40 years at a machine shop had packed enough strength into that shoulder that the frame cracked. The lock tore out of its socket, and the door flew inward, hitting the wall of the entryway. The Christmas tree shimmered in the living room. On the table stood crystal glasses, salads, champagne, and a golden duck. Beautiful. Not the ruined one, but one they had cooked again or bought somewhere. David sat at the head of the table with the TV remote, watching a New Year's special. Julie sat beside him in a fancy dress with a glass of wine. Ava was reaching for salad with her fork. All three froze. For several seconds, the only sound in the room was the holiday song on the television. Frank stopped at the entrance to the living room. Behind him stood Luke, wrapped in the sheepskin coat over his t-shirt, wearing Frank's boots on his bare feet. "David," Frank said. There was so much in that single word that David set the remote down on the table. "Now, I'm terribly sorry to interrupt your elegant social gathering, but I have one technical question. Out there, behind your fence, your own son spent about an hour counting his toes in 14-degree cold while you sat in here studying bubbles in your glass with that wise look on your face. Explain it to me, an old fool, in simple words. Is this a family tradition or some new method of cold training? Dad, why are you here? Why did you break the door?" "I'm not asking you about the door, David." "To hell with the door. I'll fix it. I asked a specific question, and I want a clear answer from a grown man, if you still are one. Can you explain this to me?" Julie stood first. She set down her glass softly, neatly, without making a sound against the tablecloth. Her face was controlled and calm. "Frank Miller, you broke into my house without an invitation and destroyed my door. I'm calling the police." Luke was punished because he ruined the holiday dinner. Children need to understand that actions have consequences. "Consequences, huh?" Frank repeated. "Interesting accounting system you've got there, Julie. It's 14 degrees outside, and the boy stands barefoot in the snow for almost an hour. In your opinion, that's an educational process for a 16-year-old? Did you happen to confuse him with a stray dog? Even dogs have warm fur." "He was out there briefly," David inserted, getting to his feet. Julie wanted him to think about. "Briefly, you say? Do you have a problem with time zones or elementary school math? The boy went outside the gate at 4 o'clock, and now it's 5. What army did you serve in where an hour counts as briefly?" David fell silent. "David, let's refresh your memory. When you were 16 and smashed my old Chevy into a birch tree, did I throw you out into the cold without pants? When you failed your exams spectacularly, did I tie you to a gas can in the garage overnight? When you broke the neighbor's window, did I keep you on water for a day and a half? That's different, Dad. And what exactly is the difference? Explain it to me. Is it that back then you were my own son, and my soul hurt for you, but Luke is now like some unwanted tenant to you, one you wouldn't mind throwing away? This is my house." Julie stepped forward. "And Luke lives here by my rules. If he doesn't like it, he can find somewhere else." "She's right, Dad." David didn't lift his eyes. "It's her house. We live here on her terms." Frank looked at his son and saw a man he did not recognize. The boy he had taught to walk, the boy he had shown how to hold a file, had become a man who traded his own child for a warm corner. Frank took out his phone. "That's it, dear hostess. The show is over. Here's the plan. Either you apologize to the boy right now, loudly and clearly enough for the neighbors to hear, or I take out this phone and arrange a very entertaining holiday for both of you with the police and Child Protective Services. The boy is 16. You kept him out in the cold almost an hour with no shoes. You're the house lawyer here. Want me to suggest how child endangerment and abuse are classified in Iowa? Or will you figure it out yourself?" Julie's lips trembled, just a little, only for a second, but Frank saw it. "Luke, stop staring at this hissing snake and grab your things." He turned to his grandson. "Take me to your royal chambers. Let's see what's left of your belongings." Luke's room was a small space tucked away at the end of the upstairs hallway. A narrow bed, One little cabinet, a north-facing window, and a cast-iron radiator barely warm to the touch. Bare walls. On the other side of the wall was Ava's room, spacious, with bright curtains and shelves. Luke silently packed his things into a gym bag. David appeared in the doorway. "Dad, please don't. We'll figure it out. I'll talk to Julie. Everything will get better, I promise." "You've been untying this knot for 3 years, David. Any minute now you'll get calluses on your tongue. Enough of this comedy. Your promises aren't worth enough to paste onto the wallpaper in this hallway." "Dad, last week she didn't let me eat for 2 days," Luke said, without turning around as he zipped the bag, "because of a glass. And you stayed quiet." David stepped back from the door. Downstairs in the entryway, Julie stood with her arms crossed. "If you take him, I'm calling the police. This is the removal of a minor. You'll go to jail. Call The Hague if you want." Frank stopped in front of her. "While you're at it, explain to the officer how you had a 16-year-old boy doing a flamingo routine in the snow while you were in here stuffing yourself with baked bird. Whether that duck was first-rate or second-rate, the investigators can sort out." At the door, Luke turned around and looked at his father, who stood in the hallway with his arms hanging at his sides. "Dad, I love you, but if you loved me, you wouldn't have allowed this." David did not move. They drove back to Des Moines through the blizzard. The countdown to midnight was ringing on the radio. Luke flinched, and Frank switched it to music. The house on the edge of town welcomed them with warmth. 75 degrees. That had been Margaret's rule. She used to say life was too short to freeze inside your own walls. Luke walked into the room that had always been his, sat on the bed, touched the knitted blanket with his grandmother's pattern, and went quiet, looking at the photographs. He was little, holding a fishing rod. He was with his grandparents in the garden. Margaret was laughing at the kitchen table. For several seconds, he just sat there, stroking the wool edge. "So, traveler," Frank called from the kitchen, "isn't it time to kill the worm? Isn't your stomach playing a marching band in there?" Frank opened the freezer and pulled out 3 containers labeled in his wife's handwriting. The problem was that the labels had partly rubbed off. One read chick, another read Geber, and the third had no identifying marks at all. "All right, Luke. Attention on the testing grounds." Frank set all 3 on the table with the air of a general standing over a battle map. "We have ourselves a holiday quiz. Guess the food. This lot labeled chick could be noble chicken, or it could be dried apricots from 3 years ago. The gear option is either wild mushrooms or stern buckwheat. And the third unidentified object is a pure mystery box, one of your grandmother's secret developments. Stakes are high. Our stomachs are on the line. What do we open?" Luke, standing in the kitchen doorway, laughed quietly. They thawed the one labeled chick. It turned out to be chicken. Frank began seasoning it with grand enthusiasm, but he mixed up the jars. Salt and sugar stood in identical containers. Margaret had always told them apart by some private sign she had taken with her. Luke intercepted the chicken at the last second, licked his finger, and grimaced. "Grandpa, is this sugar? Come on now. Are you sure? Do you have a diamond eye, or did your intuition work at 100%? You were about to make caramel chicken. I surrender. Your late grandmother spent 40 years of married life trying to carve even an apprentice cook out of me and failed. I always either undersalted things or turned cutlets into anthracite, and you expect culinary masterpieces from an old machinist in 5 minutes. Take the wheel." "Chef." Luke silently took the salt shaker from him, moved his grandfather away from the stove, and finished the cooking himself. Calmly, skillfully, with real knowledge. Frank stood nearby, watching, and felt something inside him slowly loosen. They had dinner after midnight at the kitchen table where Margaret had spent 40 straight years setting down the kettle and slicing bread. I've lived a long time, but this is the first truly fun New Year's Eve I've ever had, Frank said, looking at his grandson. We broke locks, ran from Child Protective Services, and sprinkled chicken with sugar. But you know, Luke, I think this is the most proper holiday we've had in years. At least we finally did something useful. Later, they sat by the old brick fireplace Frank had built himself. Luke told him he had a friend named Ethan who was teaching him guitar, that he'd gotten A's and B's last semester, and that he liked programming. Frank took Margaret's photo with the guitar down from the wall. Your grandmother spent her whole life wanting to pluck a few strings. She even hid a self-teaching guitar book somewhere, always saying, "When I retire, I'll sit on the porch and play." But life is a sly thing. It flies by, and that's that. So remember your grandfather's advice. There is no such thing as later. Either you grab the bull by the horns now, or you walk around without a guitar for the rest of your life. I miss Grandma. Luke looked at the photograph, running a finger over the bent corner. I miss her too, Luke, more than I can say. Without her, this house is just bricks with a roof. We miss her badly, kid. The fire crackled in the fireplace, throwing orange shadows onto the walls. Luke began talking again. Not through nerves now, not through shame, but the way people speak to someone who finally believes them. He told him how Julie would force his father to choose. Either my rules or both of you leave. How David chose silence every time. How once he told his son, endure it for a couple of years. You'll finish high school and leave. He's afraid, Grandpa. Afraid to go back to Des Moines, live on one paycheck, and start carrying everything again. And I'm just the price he pays for her house. Frank stared into the fire. He remembered Margaret's last look when she had said, "Something is wrong with that boy." And he had waved it off. He remembered fishing, the bruise, the question, "Can I really stay with you?" He remembered the previous New Year's Eve, tea, television, a warm house, and a boy sleeping on the back seat of a car in the cold. Oh, Luke, I missed it. Old stump that I am, I shut my ears and missed it. I should have torn that whole operation apart last New Year's Eve, but I sat there with my ears hanging open. Forgive your fool of a grandfather for making you endure all that. Luke said nothing. Then he moved closer to the fireplace and rested his head on his grandfather's shoulder. All right, soldier, enough gloom. Frank covered him with his hand. We've completed the minimum program. Now we move on to a full renovation of life. I'll settle the question of your school. We'll get your documents out of that fortress. Nobody will have a thing to complain about. You'll live with me. There's plenty of room here. Burn this into your brain. This is your real home. And to sleep and eat peacefully here, you don't need to pass any tests. You're home. Got it? Luke fell asleep in his room around 1 in the morning, curled under his grandmother's knitted blanket, for the first time in 3 years without listening for footsteps behind the door. Frank sat in the kitchen, drinking cold tea and looking at the photograph of Margaret with the guitar, when someone knocked at the door. A demanding official knock, the kind only people in uniform make. 2 police officers stood on the porch. Behind them were Julie in an unbuttoned fur-lined coat, and David, his head pulled down into his shoulders. "Frank Miller?" the older officer asked. "We received a complaint about unlawful entry into a residence and the removal of a minor. May we come in?" Frank stepped aside and let them all into the kitchen. Julie entered first, collected, straight-backed, with offended dignity on her face. "This man," she pointed at Frank, "broke down the door of my house, burst in without an invitation, and forcibly took my stepson away. The boy was at home, safe, until his grandfather staged a rampage. She spoke with restraint, her voice trembling just slightly, exactly enough to invite sympathy. David stood by the wall, studying the floor. "Our dear Julie," Frank said, turning to the officer, purely out of modesty, "has accidentally forgotten a few tiny details. For example, the fact that my grandson was turning blue at her gate for almost an hour. No boots, no coat, but with a full understanding of his guilt. And his guilt was a duck he left in the oven a little too long. She's got a commander's camp over there, not a family home. A hard labor cell north of the Arctic Circle. Miss a recipe by a hair, and welcome to the cold. The boy is 16. He's got his whole life ahead of him, and she nearly turned him into an ice cube for a cocktail. He's exaggerating." Julie raised her voice a little. "It was 10 minutes at most, and he was wearing a jacket." "May we speak with Luke?" the older officer asked. Luke came into the kitchen barefoot, wearing his grandfather's padded jacket. When he saw Julie, his shoulders jerked upward, and his arms pressed against his sides. It was instant, reflexive. The officer noticed it and filed it away. "Luke, are you here voluntarily?" "Yes. Tell us what happened today." Luke spoke briefly, but clearly. The duck, the shouting, the phone taken away, the keys taken, the door closed behind him, the gate, the snow. His grandfather arrived around 5. All that time, he had stood outside in a t-shirt. "That's not true." Julie stepped forward. "He was dressed, and I let him out briefly so he could think about his behavior." The officer silently looked at Luke's feet. Red frostbite marks were clearly visible. The skin on his toes still shone with an unhealthy gloss. Both officers turned to David. "David Miller, tell us what happened. How long was your son outside?" Julie stepped closer to her husband and took him by the forearm. The gesture looked caring, but her fingers tightened visibly. The senior officer quietly asked her to step away. She did not let go right away. David stood staring at the floor, hands clasped in front of him, and stayed silent so long that Luke turned toward the window. Then he began to speak quietly, with effort, forcing out every word. "Luke is telling the truth. The duck overcooked." Julie got angry. She told him to go outside the gate. It was around 4 o'clock. "Did you lock the door?" the officer asked. Julie did. She said not to let him in, under any circumstances. "David," Julie turned toward him. "What are you doing? Do you understand what you're saying?" But David had already crossed the line where stopping was impossible. The words came on their own, one after another, and each one cost him 3 years of silence. Nights in the garage, food withheld for a broken glass, control over the phone, being forbidden to speak at the table, punishment by cold for every mistake. "Shut up." Julie had lost control now. "You'll destroy everything I built for us." David raised his head and looked straight at her for the first time in 3 years without looking away. "What did you build, Julie?" "A house where my son is afraid to breathe." The senior officer closed his notebook and said the materials regarding cruel treatment of a minor would be forwarded to investigators and Child Protective Services. Julie was warned about potential charges for child endangerment and neglect. David was warned that the family would be placed under preventive supervision. "This is absurd." Julie backed toward the door. "He's not my child. I'm not obligated to raise him." "You live with a minor and are married to his father," the officer said. "You carry responsibility too." They led her to the car. In the doorway, she turned back toward David, and her face became the same face Luke had seen for 3 years. Hard, domineering, allowing no objections. "You'll regret this. Without me, you have nothing. No house, no money, nothing." David was silent for a moment, then said quietly, but loudly enough for everyone to hear, "I have a son. That's enough." The door closed behind the officers. The kitchen became quiet. Only the fireplace crackled, and snow whispered outside the window. David sat down on a chair, dropped his hands between his knees, and cried. Choked, broken sobs, the way men cry when they've forgotten how. Luke walked over and put a hand on his father's shoulder. "I'm sorry," David breathed. "I should've protected you in the first year." "You did the most important thing today," Frank said from the chair by the fireplace. "You broke the spine of that fear when it mattered most. Going up against a chainsaw in a dress like that, in front of witnesses, and admitting you spent 3 years obediently sitting under the bench, well, that takes more guts than unloading a freight car of wet coal by yourself. So wipe your nose. You acted like a man." "Dad, it's over now," Luke said. "We're here." By April, the snow had melted, and the house truly came back to life. David transferred to a plant in Des Moines. Luke moved to the local high school. The three Miller men learned how to live together with varying degrees of success. David threw a red sweater into the washing machine with white shirts, and the result was predictably pink. Frank examined the former shirt, holding it at arm's length. "You know, I ran this household alone for 8 months. I scrubbed work pants and undershirts in a regular plastic basin. And not once, imagine this, did I manage to turn my belongings into a glamorous branch of a fashion factory. Everything stayed a strict, practical, masculine color." "Grandpa, that's because everything you own is the same color." "Gray," Luke remarked, already typing into his phone how to whiten fabric. "Don't you sew Paris fashion onto me here. Gray is the most respectable color for a normal person. It doesn't show dirt. It's reliable, like a proven tractor, and no enemy dye can ruin it. Perfect for crawling around the garage or fishing for bluegill." Luke silently saved the situation with bleach, while Frank grumbled until the end of the week that his new roommates had taken over the TV remote and that he used to have hot tea and silence at any hour of the day. "I was naive," he muttered one evening when Luke turned on music. "I thought I was rescuing you from slavery and returning silence and grandfatherly peace to this house. Instead, you've staged a variety concert for Police Appreciation Day right here in the middle of April. The bass is making my mustache vibrate." It was happy grumbling. All three of them understood that. On the wall beside Margaret's photographs, new ones appeared. Luke on the ice with the fishing rod he got for New Year's. The three Millers by the fireplace, taken on a timer. Crooked, but everyone was smiling. Julie received a suspended sentence and community service. She sold the house in Ankeny and moved in with relatives. Ava lived with her grandmother, and according to acquaintances, she seemed calmer than before. Once, David admitted to Frank that he felt guilty about the girl left without a family. Frank answered shortly, "The farther she is from Julie, the better for that girl's mind. Maybe she'll grow into a normal person and not a robot." One evening after dinner, Luke announced that he had changed mind about engineering school and wanted to study education. "I want to work with kids who go through what I went through," he said, looking his grandfather in the eye. "I want to be the teacher who notices, who asks why a child is quiet, who doesn't walk past." Frank turned toward the fireplace and stayed silent for several seconds, wrestling with tears. "Your late grandmother always liked to say, if old hurts have burned everything inside you, the best cure is to lay yourself down like a bone in the road and keep that same sickness from reaching someone else's heart." Did she really say that? She had enough good thoughts in her lifetime to fill 3 volumes of philosophy. The shame of it is, I was young then, stubborn as a mule, and while I was rebuilding carburetors, half her lectures flew right past my ears. That evening, Luke practiced guitar, getting ready for a school concert. Ethan helped him over video call. Frank peeked in, listened, and unexpectedly announced that in his day he had sung in the factory amateur performance group and knew at least 3 chords. He took the guitar, pressed something that vaguely resembled a chord, and sang loudly, from the soul, magnificently off-key. On the phone screen, Ethan grabbed his head. "Grandpa," Luke said carefully, taking the instrument back. "You'll be in the audience, first row, but we'll do the singing." What do you understand about stern masculine vocals? In our day, for that kind of heartfelt delivery and volume, people were given certificates and wellness vouchers, not robbed of guitars. "Dad," David yelled from the next room, "they kicked you out of that performance group in 1976, Mom told me." All 3 laughed, and Ethan laughed on the phone too. The April evening was warm and soft. Frank and Luke sat on the porch, watching David awkwardly dig up Margaret's old garden. "Grandpa, are we going fishing this year?" As soon as the ice is completely gone, the minnows push toward shore, and the crappie start spawning, we'll grab the tackle and run. We won't even finish our tea. Do you think we'll catch anything bigger than last year? With your fantastic luck, we'll pull out at least a legendary 300-pound prehistoric sturgeon by the gills. Or you'll catch the goldfish herself on an ordinary worm. They sat in silence for a while. It was the kind of silence that did not need to be filled. "Grandpa, thank you for coming that day." "Where else would I have gone, you rascal?" "Leave you unsupervised for a week, and next time you'll be out in the cold setting culinary records again. So thank you for showing that Miller backbone of ours and not breaking." David stuck the shovel into the soil, wiped his forehead, and called across the yard. "Dad, what did Mom plant here? Carrots or beets?" "Plant both at once and you won't miss. Put in more garlic too, and dill for pickling. And over there in the corner, there used to be some unknown clever seedling with purple bumps. I was afraid to weed it alone for 30 years in case it bit my arm off at the elbow." Luke laughed. The house was warm. Photographs hung on the wall, old and new. Margaret with a guitar, and Luke with a guitar beside her through the years. 3 men had learned that family is not walls, and it is not somebody's house. Family is when there is someone to open the door when you are freezing. And now I want to ask you something from the heart. What would you have done in Frank's place? Have you ever seen someone finally choose family, truth, or justice after staying silent for too long? Tell me in the comments. If this story touched you, give the video a like, subscribe to the channel, and tap the bell so you don't miss the next one. Sometimes one honest voice is enough to open a door someone thought would stay locked forever.